Hello, I'm Ed Reed, the editor of E-FWD, and I'm here talking to Veri Energy CEO Gavin Templeton. We're here today to talk about e-fuels. So, Gavin, what are you doing? What's the plan?
Well, the plan is we've just kicked off a pre-feed looking at the opportunity to produce e-fuels at Sullenvoe Terminal. So I guess, background for this really is the core offering is around the fact that this Shetland Islands is blessed with an incredible wind resource. It's the windiest place in Europe. And we believe that it's going to be a great place to generate green hydrogen, and the combination of green hydrogen with biogenic CO2 can produce e-fuel. So we recently kicked off a pre-feed to look at that opportunity.
And so, I mean, I suppose what problem does it solve, right? I mean, I think obviously there's sort of the opportunity of this extraordinary resource. How do you turn this into a sort of a solution?
Well, I think one of the big challenges, I mean, there's obviously a huge debate about what can be electrified and what you're going to have some sort of sustainable molecule to power. And I think the general consensus that aviation is one of those, certainly long haul aviation is one of those industries that we're going to have to think very creatively about, how do you develop a sustainable molecule to power long haul aviation. So I think there's been quite a big focus on sustainable aviation fuel. I think that's actually going to evolve into a conversation around marine diesel as well. But certainly the focus at the moment is on SAF. And the UK government has been quite focused on thinking about how it can generate its own domestic production of SAF. And I think that lends us to the conclusion that if you're going to do it anywhere, you should be doing it where the renewable resource is its highest. I think there's also competition. There's different types of SAF, right? There's SAF that you can get from, it's called HEFA SAF, which comes from organic matter. There's kind of second generation SAF, which is around processing waste, black bin waste. And what we're actually doing is third generation SAF. It's a power to liquid SAF. So it's that combination of biogenic CO2 and green hydrogen. And as you know, we're obviously developing as well kind of carbon storage opportunity around Sullenvoe. So there's quite distinct synergies with the fact we're going to be importing biogenic CO2 to Sullenvoe, and the idea that you potentially can put that in the ground and that would generate, if you're producing biogenic CO2, you can generate a carbon dioxide removal credit, or you can turn that into a fuel with the combination of green hydrogen. And I think we believe it's the only place, the only site in the UK that is looking at that combination of both carbon storage and e-fuels.
And so, why are you working on these projects? I mean, it feels like obviously you've got a sort of like a history kind of coming out of EnQuest. What's the sort of the move over the fence into sort of third generation SAF?
Well, I think the kind of genesis of Veri, you mentioned our parent company EnQuest, which is the operator of the Sullenvoe terminal. And you've got a terminal and you've got a situation in the North Sea where North Sea oil is declining, but you've got this incredible piece of infrastructure, right? You've not only got the infrastructure, but you've got incredible capability. You've got skills there, both in terms of the skills that exist at Sullenvoe, but also the skills that exist in the wider oil and gas industry. And we see direct, crossover from those skills. Those skills in oil and gas are exactly the skills that I need, whether it's looking at carbon storage or whether it's looking at SAF production. It's the same skills. So I think as we think about life of for the terminal in 2050 and beyond, these sorts of things emerge. And I was talking to an investor about the place-based solution, and it goes back to that point of, if you have the best wind resource, if you have the best renewable resource, you got to think about how you bring demand to supply. There's obviously a big conversation, Ed, about grid infrastructure, and it's critically important. There's lots of cables being built. I get lots of people complaining to me in the north of Scotland about pylons going up in their back garden, right? But what we're actually trying to do is bring more demand to supply. Can we create activity close to the source of the electricity that can generate products which are absolutely essential? There's hundreds of thousands of tons of shortfall of SAF in terms of the UK government's own figures, but also create that economic activity as well more locally.
And so, what's the next step? So you're in pre-feed now, and obviously, you talked about the sort of the government targets, and I think obviously they set some kind of quite big targets about the sort of percentages of SAF that needs to be in the sort of the aviation chain. So how quickly do you think things might move ahead?
So we, as we mentioned, we're in pre-feed. We're delighted to be working with some real world-class OEMs who are contributing to the work that we're doing, the likes of ITM Power, BSE Methanol, Veolia on the electricals, BBB on the electricals, Veolia on the water. So we're going through that process design at the moment, and the challenge in the process design really, Ed, is how do you minimize hydrogen storage, right?
Mm.
Hydrogen storage is extremely expensive. The other challenge is these electrolyzers, and certainly electrolyzers are evolving all the time, but they typically do not like variable power. They like firm power. And degradation increases when you apply variable power. So what we're trying to assess at the moment is whether we can work with the electrolyzer providers to, you know, electrolyze that water. We've got a huge potable water resource that we can tap into SBT to turn that into hydrogen, but then immediately process into a fuel or the next phase, if you like. And we're looking at two different processes. We're looking at the Fischer-Tropsch process, from which you can, there's lots of history behind the Fischer-Tropsch process, where you can create a synthetic crude, which then requires further processing. Or we're looking at methanol to jet, so it's turning it into an e-methanol. Which again, further processing required to take that on to jet. So we're looking at those two different processes, but the critical element is, minimizing degradation on the electrolyzer, minimizing hydrogen storage. So that's part of the process design. And we're building confidence that we can get there, right? We're building confidence. We're talking to electrolyzer providers who believe that they've solved some of these issues. I think it's not only us that are looking at powering our electrolyzers with renewable power. So that's part of the pre-feed. So confidence is building, but expectation that step will be finishing around Q4 when we'll be looking to go into the feed stage. Phased approach, Ed. We're not, we want to make sure that we're doing it in a way that we can build. So the first phase will be, we're looking at a 50 megawatt electrolyzer, which is still significant, but we're wanting to scale that up. And clearly the opportunity around the wind resource that exists in Shetland, there's gigawatts of floating offshore wind plan. There's more, hundreds of megawatts of onshore wind plans. So can we harness some of that electricity for more economic activity locally?
And I suppose, sort of thinking about sort of the landscape that's sort of in support of these projects. I think obviously the government's kind of come out with various plans to sort of help support SAF. Is that enough to kind of give you the sort of the certainty to kind of move ahead? Obviously, pre-feed allowing and everything else, but is there sort of enough sort of top-down direction?
So interestingly, it's heated up in the last couple of weeks. I don't know if you've been watching the revenue support mechanism legislation, which has come to Parliament around SAF production. And that's very recent. And they're actually planning to put in place, equivalent of a CFD for SAF. This is very similar to what exists in terms of how they kickstarted offshore wind and, what exists today across renewables. So expectation actually that is going to be coming into legislation towards the end of next year. So that's a new piece of legislation that helps us build confidence. The second part, obviously, we're already into, we just finalized hydrogen allocation round 2. Expectation there's going to be a hydrogen allocation round 3. Now that specifically focuses on the green hydrogen production element. But we're also looking at that as a way to mobilize the other parts of the infrastructure. Can we get that support on the hydrogen production, which is, the biggest cost element, and certainly the power part of that is the biggest cost element. So there's a couple of different paths, but we remain very engaged with the Department of Transport, with DESNZ, with the Scottish Government as well on our plans to see how we can support, improving the activity.
Great. I mean, it sounds like a really interesting project to watch, and I think certainly kind of seeing kind of come out of that sort of existing infrastructure, it feels like, the point when the North Sea is sort of facing challenges, it feels like a really interesting way in which we can sort of try and think about sort of building on what we've got and where we'd like to be. But listen, that's all we've got time for today. We're all about seeking pragmatic solutions to the challenges thrown up by the energy system. So let's keep taking those pragmatic steps forward together.
Thanks so much, Ed. Good to chat.